All right, guys. Thanks for dropping in. And for those of you that shared with us where you're from, it's always fun to be connected in this virtual way from people from all over. So I'm McCall Hardison. I work on the QuantHub team, and I am in Birmingham, Alabama, where most of our team is located. So it's good to see you guys. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today. We've got Matt Cowell, CEO of QuantHub. Matt, you can give your wave. And then we've got Dr. Scott Davies, who is the CEO of PointLeader. Hey, Scott. And today, Matt's going to start us off, but I wanted to let you know that keep that chat rolling. If you have thoughts, if you have questions, my job today is going to be to get your questions to our great speakers. And so we can cover the information, not just what we've planned, but what you guys want to hear. So we're excited to kick everything off. And Matt, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, McCall, and Dr. Scott. Thanks for joining. I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. I don't know that I've ever spoken to anyone that had managed a ranch. So you've herded cattle. You were, I believe, a welder, and then became a PhD psychologist. So I maybe we'll have to spend an entire other webinar actually talking about that background, because that's fascinating.
I wanted a job where I could work inside, actually. I'd gotten tired of working outside, herding cattle around, having rain coming down my back. So there you go. There's the motivation.
Well, thanks for being on this, Scott, and thanks to all of you for joining. Times are pretty interesting right now, and with the coronavirus and a lot of other things happening, certainly there has been a large effect on the workforce, really globally. There's been a tremendous surge in unemployment, almost near unprecedented surge in unemployment, really in an extremely short amount of time. Just looking at that from a U.S. perspective alone, there's been obviously a tremendous surge in unemployment, but it's really quite varied across the country. And then with the sort of quarantine that we've all been under, there's been a tremendous shift in companies starting to work from home and starting to work remotely, and in many cases those shifts have become permanent. We were all sort of forced to do that, right, Scott, when this all happened, and we just immediately all of a sudden just were working from home. But there's so many companies now that have started actually embracing that as their just kind of normal work mode from now on. So Facebook, Shopify, Twitter, just a couple examples. Saw some stats on LinkedIn actually where there's been a 25% increase in the number of postings of remote jobs. And so as we think about all the unemployment and the sort of rebuilding of the workforce, if you will, one of the things that companies are doing is they're shifting to remote work, but there's not a lot of conversation around the skills required for remote work. And so I wanted to pitch that over to you as maybe a first question today is to really talk about that. And I know you've done some research in this area on skills required for remote work. And so thought that'd be a good place to start. As we think about rebuilding the workforce, we need to think about what this new normal looks like, and that if it's much more of a remote oriented workforce, what does that mean for skills?
And I've looked at this for 25 years. I was shocked when I was in graduate school. I found out that there was so much bias in the assessments that were being used, the methods that were being used, and I really didn't believe that there was any reason for that. I worked in educational assessment and found out that you do not have bias in educational assessments if you build them right, and all of those things can be fixed, and that's been my mission. So most of this is based upon my values of making certain that whatever we do is fair and it's predictive. And so you take something like remote work. If one of the requirements of a job is going to be that the person is going to have to work remotely, first of all, that has to be included in the job analysis. We have to look at the job analysis and find out, is there going to be any remote work? Is it all remote work, or is it just some remote work? And then we look at the people who have succeeded in both of those areas because they're quite a bit different. Being alone all of the time versus being alone and being in the office, those are quite different. And it varies by community, it varies by many different things, the resources of the person. But for the most part, those who work all remote tend to be, I say it, that fit well, who succeed, tend to be less agreeable. And the reason that they succeed and the agreeableness has anything to do with it is because if you're working from home all of the time and you have children, you have friends, you have any of those things in your life, and you're a really nice person, then your agreeableness is going to distract you and make it difficult to work from home. Whereas if you're in the office part of the time, then that agreeableness factor doesn't get quite as much in the way because you can feed that. Extroversion is the same way. You notice that people who are lower on extroversion tend to be more successful in an all remote position, whereas if they're going to at least get to see their colleagues in the office part of the time, then their extroversion gets fed. Conscientiousness is another important factor, that if you work from remotely all of the time, then you have to be quite conscientious because you're going to have to make certain that you take care of all the details yourself. You have to follow the rules yourself. There's no, no one there as an office mate or your boss you see every day or whatever, who is going to make certain that you follow the rules. So the people who succeed in some remote work typically don't need as much conscientiousness as those who are working remotely all of the time. Drive is an interesting piece because when you put people into remote work and they're on their own, if they have a lot of drive, they're liable to wander off and leave. They may go find something else to do just because of all the drive they have. Now, if they're in the office part of the time, then you've got more control over that. That drive has some parameters around it. But it's just something you have to have quite a bit of motivation if you're going to work from home as well. I mean, that the bottom line of that, the lower threshold, the floor, if someone is not driven at all, then they're probably not going to succeed working on their own. Openness is an interesting thing. Everyone believes today that everyone should be flexible and adaptable. Well, perhaps to a point. I mean, if you're working from home, really you don't have that much openness. I mean, maybe you get to decide what time you're going to work or something like that, but you want the person to do what it is they have to do, but be open enough to know that they have to do it from home. Whereas if they're going to do both, then I think that requires even more openness. I mean, our data show that someone who has to work one place one day and someplace else the next, they're going to have more openness to experience. Sensibility is a huge one for remote workers. It taps into neuroticism, and if someone is not sensible, they're going to lack trustworthiness. They're going to fly off of the handle more. They're going to have issues that are more difficult for them to control because they are at home all alone and nobody can see, hey, let's go have a cup of coffee. Let's, that last customer was a really disturbing call and let's take a break now. And when a person is at home, I mean, an example of this was when I was managing remote workers in another company, and I would get laptops that had been flung across the room, and it was obvious that they were broken and taped up with duct tape. And I'm thinking back, wow, that person was really having a struggle. They were working there all alone in their basement, and when things went wrong, they really had a hard time dealing with that. I think, the intelligence factors, it really depends on the job, but those who have more strategic intelligence just tend to do better at any kind of remote work. I mean, it just requires planning your day better. It requires planning transportation better, a lot of things than if you get to work in an office all of the time.
Yeah.
So these are somewhat generalizations, and there are certain situations, and I think that anyone can succeed in all remote work or some remote work. But when you're looking at someone's behaviors and trying to figure out why they are succeeding or not, one thing to do is to think about it in these terms, that, well, the reason that you're having trouble focusing on the job is because you're so nice to everyone all the time that whenever your kids want to go play, you don't have it in you to say no. And it's just, this is a guide, I think, that helps people understand others and how to help them through whatever it is that they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, you think about your job as a leader of an individual is to help coach them through things like this, right? So if they're struggling working remotely, or you're actually about to start working remotely, and if you know this information about individuals, you can sort of head that off a little bit before you even start having issues, and talk about their tendencies, talk about different aspects of their personality or how they work, and be able to coach them through that. Have you seen this type of information be useful in that type of context?
Yes, absolutely. So conscientiousness is a good one, right? And sensibility both. You can check in on the people. You can make sure if you have for your remote workforce, make certain that they have policy documents. Make certain that they have things that are going to help them see that they still have rules, that just because they're working remotely doesn't mean that all the rules went away. And people who are high on conscientiousness, they need those rules. I mean, they're looking for those rules. If they don't see those rules, they'll quit or fail. And there's things that we can do as CEOs, as managers, as HR professionals to help those people succeed just by watching their behaviors and thinking about these things and saying, well, where's that coming from, right? Because we're not the same. Each of us are different. That's what makes the world so wonderful, is we're such a diverse group of humans. And sensibility is a big one. I learned that keep a real close eye on your folks and make certain that even though they may not be saying anything about how stressed they are, do whatever you can to keep tabs on them, let them understand it's okay. We're all going through this together, and realize that they may need that every day, whereas perhaps you or I don't need that every day. Mm-hmm. and maybe they do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also a big part of leadership, is realizing that people are individuals. Like you said, there's so much, we are a very diverse population, and hopefully there's a good amount of diversity in a given company. And we need to realize that people are individuals and have individual characteristics, and having insight into that as you're sort of thinking about, big transitions, whether you had a big layoff and now you're rehiring and you're looking for more diversity, and you think about individual characteristics of people, or you're transitioning to remote and you're trying to coach people through that. I mean, getting into this type of information is invaluable.
My research on minorities and communities of color, and there are communities in which this isn't as common of knowledge as there are in other communities. And therefore, this helps with that. This is one way to increase diversity, to overcome bias, to overcome discrimination, is to make certain that everyone realizes that not everyone has had the same experiences. Perhaps one person's parents may have worked remotely, or brothers or sisters, or whomever. And in other cases, I'm Native American, and there are folks on the reservation who've never worked remote in their life, and they don't know anyone in their family who's ever worked remotely, and they wouldn't have any idea about any of this stuff. If you stuck them out in a remote job, they wouldn't have the slightest idea what to do. And so, as managers and professionals, and all of us wanting to get rid of the bias in our processes, well, here's a really good place to start, is to understand who your people are, and that we may be the first folks to help them understand what issues they may or may not have in a remote position. And then we're helping not just that individual, but we're helping the family and the community, where that's what it's all about, is helping communities of people.
Yeah. So when you think about, again, kind of going back, and companies are sort of hopefully coming out of past this, this a little bit of craziness of the last 2+ months, 3 months, and in some cases are starting to rebuild. Things are reopening at least a little bit, and they're rebuilding. You and I've talked in the past about this concept around job fit, and as you're rehiring in a workforce, and there are a lot of places that are retail and in places where they're hiring just a tremendous number of people because they were shut for a long enough period of time where those people went away. And so they're rehiring in pretty significant numbers. So when you think about job fit and that kind of hiring process and a lot of the conversation right now around diversity, talk about that a little bit of really rehiring that workforce.
It's a huge opportunity for organizations, I believe. The unemployment rate was so low for the last 5 years that people were taking anyone with a heartbeat, right? We didn't have a lot of opportunity from 2016 to 2020. The unemployment rate was really low.
Yeah.
And so that's not a good time to improve your workforce. It's not even a good time to increase the diversity of your workforce. You've got whoever you've got, and that's who you've got to get along with, and you got to develop them and do whatever you have. Now, given the events that have just happened, it almost seems like it should become a social imperative that we do change up who it is that we're bringing back into the organizations. And I'm not meaning to be harsh or cold-hearted or anything else. I mean, you had the employees who you had, and you care for those employees, and by all means support them. On the other side of that coin is this is an opportunity for people to look at their hiring practices. You can increase your diversity at this point because there are a lot of people without jobs, and it's a very diverse group without jobs. And it's an opportunity for us to increase diversity by getting rid of the bias and increase your talent. But by increasing diversity, it doesn't mean, so you look at that high unemployment rate, that means there's a lot of people out there that are looking for jobs. So you've got your choice of the talent to choose from. And you should be able to find people now who probably better fit your jobs. I mean, all of us know someone that we've hired that didn't fit their job very well. And if we hadn't have needed them, we probably would have let them go. Well, there's probably not a good reason to bring them back in at this point. They'll fit better somewhere else. You're doing them a favor. Let them go do something else where they do fit better, and bring in someone who does fit the job well. And oh, by the way, do it in an unbiased and fair manner, right? You use methods where you know that you're not going to continue to hurt communities of color because they've already suffered enough. There's been a perfect storm here for hurting communities of color in that the COVID-19 epidemic has hit them harder, unemployment has hit them harder, everything is kind of turned against them, but it's a wonderful opportunity for companies to decide we're going to fix what's wrong with our organization and help communities of color, oh, by the way, at the same time, by using unbiased methods to select people who fit our jobs well, where people will be successful and happy, and productive people are better members of their community than those folks who hate their jobs.
Yeah. We actually at QuantHub, we serve most of our customers are in more the technical space, so they're hiring technical people, and even beyond the sort of process to fill those roles in terms of like the screening process. Oftentimes we as technology leaders will say, well, we just don't have the minorities in the funnel, in the top of the funnel. But then if you go and you read your job descriptions, and in many cases you hear about this programmer culture, which is it's a male dominated culture on like the programming team or the data science team or whatever. And if you then go look at your job postings, it's clear that it's that type of culture. And so it's evident all the way throughout to the job descriptions. And so you're actually, you're reducing your pool before you ever start screening people. And so if it is an opportunity right now to do that, is to increase diversity within companies. And there's so much value in having diverse perspectives. There has to be a purposeful effort to make that happen and to actually get candidates from these different populations into the funnel. Obviously, you need your screening processes to be unbiased as well, and we'll talk about that next, but it has to start with actually finding those people and getting them into into the process. And I posted a video a couple weeks ago, and I talked a lot about how when so often we want to hire from our networks, and we, when we hire from our networks, what we're typically doing is we're hiring people that look just like us. And so we're actually marketing jobs to our networks. We're telling our employees to post things to their networks. Well, they also look just like us. And so we're not really going to increase the diversity in the actual pool of candidates, which is where it has to start.
I urge folks to talk to a program evaluator. And program evaluation is an interesting little profession that I've gotten quite a bit of training in, because I think I realized early on that the whole selection process needs to be evaluated from a program perspective in order to find out what is wrong. And the thing that you learn from program evaluation and program evaluators, we tend to use stakeholder feedback. The first thing we're all going to say is go identify your stakeholders, but find out who has anything to do with this, right? So whenever you're talking about hiring in a large company or any company, you're talking about your community, any possible applicant that you want to reach out to. You should probably get stakeholders from that community together. If you're really serious about this, find out what those folks say you should do. And I've learned so much from that. At a project I worked on years ago for the MTA, they were having trouble at the recruitment stage, and the bias was starting right there. They were not recruiting enough folks of color. And we identified areas. We got stakeholders together and said, how do we recruit Black men? And they said, well, go to high school football games, go to high school basketball games, go to the places where they are and tell them about the jobs. And it's simple things like that often, but we wouldn't have known that if we wouldn't have had a focus group with stakeholders in order to come up with that. And it helps you with things like vocabulary to use, to make sure. Once at the Department of the Navy, we were battling this discrimination problem, and we found out that it was in the actual job announcement. The job announcement had been written in such complex language that the target audience didn't even know what it meant, unless they had college degrees. Well, the job didn't require a college degree. So you're absolutely right, Matt. You have to look at the whole system and treat the whole thing as if, we want to cleanse it of any biased language, of any biased vocabulary, all the way from recruitment, job announcements, all the way through the job application, the assessments, the interview process, onboarding, performance measurement, because at every one of those steps, there's the possibility of it either being fair or of it being biased. And you're right, when you get into the assessments, you have to be really careful, because I think every assessment provider in the country says they are fair. But if you make them give you the research that shows they are fair, you find out, well, no, they've really done nothing to make it fair. They're claiming fairness, but there weren't any minority members involved in reviewing the items that are on the assessment. There was no field test data across groups that was compared. There's no reason at all to believe that what they have written and sold is fair. In fact, it oftentimes appears that the assessment was designed to screen out minorities rather than to help reduce bias. So, it's very much, you need to be an informed buyer and get someone to understand that research to find out, is this really fair and unbiased, right, or not?
So let's talk a little bit about interview processes and kind of selection, and not necessarily assessments, but kind of manual face-to-face interviews. What are some forms of unconscious bias that in your research you've seen come out of those types of interview processes where they haven't leveraged assessments?
Well, getting back to job experience, unless job experience is very much a requirement that you cannot get around, that you have to have had this job in order to have that job. You have to have been a police officer before you can be a police chief, or something like that. Then you look at what is it that we're really after, and make sure that the interviewer isn't just tapping into people that they would like to go hang out with and drink beer, which are probably going to look a lot like them. And don't let them ask questions that are totally based upon job experience. Is going back to my Native American friends, those folks often have never had a job in gaming, perhaps, and that's the job that they're applying for. Well, they're not going to be, maybe they'd be a fine person in gaming, but if you ask the questions in such a way, give me an example of a time that you were dealing cards and someone got up and left or whatever, right? Well, they've never done that, so they're going to fail that. And really, you can teach them that. If it's a teachable skill, then don't ask it in an interview, because it's going to be biased against folks who haven't had those experiences. So they need to get more at the commonalities amongst people. I mean, all humans have had experiences sometime in their life that have to do with dealing with people, dealing with numbers, dealing with processes, dealing with whatever it is that you want them to deal with that's a requirement of the job. And as you know, caring human beings, being kind, we should get at that least common denominator, right? And decide, okay, so what is that? What is it that we can ask about that all of us have had that experience? And really, it probably tells us as much as we need to know. And the way that I think you keep interviewers reined in, so to speak, is give them a structured interview questionnaire by all means. Don't let them just say whatever they want. This is a point where flexibility and adaptability is not going to lead to diversity. It's going to lead to them unconsciously choosing more people just like themselves, or perhaps consciously, or whatever the case may be. You need to structure those interview questions, train the interviewers, test them, make certain that, run them through 3 or 4 interviewees and make sure that they're doing it the way that you want it to be done. And if they can't, don't let them do it.
Yeah, we think about kind of what you were talking about a minute ago on, there are certain types of roles where people need very specific skills, but they have to either have those skills or have the ability to learn those skills quickly. And the latter part of that is hard to assess, is the ability to learn things quickly. And so we think about that a lot. I mean, we assess for technical skills, and one of the pieces of feedback that we think about a lot is having, if things are extremely specific, then you're really just testing what they have experience with. You're not necessarily testing what they can actually learn. And so that's definitely something we think about. And back to your point on diversity, I mean, then you're really narrowing the pool of people that could possibly qualify for that position, because you're looking for something extremely specific.
That's right. And so you look at what is it that would tell you if a person can code or not, even though maybe they've never coded. Maybe they've never sat down at a computer and done anything like that other than check email and use Google. Well, there's where you need to use a fair and unbiased assessment of their ability, of their personality. Are they conscientious enough to learn this stuff? Are they, do they have the intelligence to learn it? And here's where it drives me nuts what people do with ability tests and intelligence tests, is they seem to think that there's this linear relationship between the smarter you are, the better you're going to do the job. That's where bias occurs. And it's not true at all that the smarter you are, the better you're going to do the job in nearly all cases. It's a step function, right? And you find that level that, okay, and most of the time it's pretty low. And it is typically like a standard deviation below the mean, that if you're at least that smart, if you've got at least that much ability, okay, and you've got conscientiousness and drive enough to learn, you'll be fine. That's plenty, for whatever the job is. And it differs by job, that, and you keep that, if people could get it out of their mind, that relationship that we were taught in school of, the relationship between ability and performance is this linear thing, because we don't care, right? We should forget about that. What we really want to know is that step, that level at which, well, if you're not at least this smart, you're really going to struggle with learning to program. And then you get them into the interview, you get them into skills tests, and you train them and develop them, and have a good notion that they're going to be able to succeed at what you're going to teach them to do.
Yeah. One of the things that you talked about earlier is you talked about different types. Oh, McCall, did you have something to add?
Yeah, we actually got a great question that I was going to ask you guys. Kent asked, in healthcare, where most employees are licensed or certified, the pool of candidates is declining. How can predictive testing help retain people?
Using the testing to retain people?
Yeah. How can you use predictive testing to help retain people?
I think very much you look at what it is that is causing the person, what do they need to overcome, right? Mm-hmm. I worked with a hospital CEO in a leadership project who was really struggling with the people aspect of his job. He was doing fine on the hard skills. He didn't have any trouble with the finance part of the job. He didn't have any trouble with partnerships. But he couldn't get along with people at all. I assessed him, and I found out that his agreeableness was at the 10th percentile. His extroversion was at the 10th percentile. This person had no people skill. He had no potential for that stuff at all. It just wasn't within him. And when I talked to him about it, he told me he'd taken the job because they needed the money to buy a house, and that he never wanted to be in any kind of a job like that. And we talked about, well, what are some of the things you can do? Well, you're not very agreeable, so probably quit talking to other people a whole lot as much as you can and let someone else do that. Everyone works on a team. Figure out what it is that is wrong, what it is that's inhibiting you from being successful. And an HR manager can do this with assessment results. A good trainer can do this. A mentor can do this and help the individual understand that if you're going to be promoted, if you're going to get in the job, here are the things that are going to cause you the most issues. And I understand it's just who you are. That's fine. We love you anyway. But you're going to have to find a teammate or someone to take care of the people part of your job. Maybe your job needs to become a partnership. Maybe there's all kinds of maybes. There's a lot of ways to help someone overcome their weaknesses, so to speak, and use them. I mean, he was probably really good at firing folks or something like that. I don't know. And it's just putting some thought to it, understanding who that person is, and then you can understand their behaviors and help them structure things in such a way that they will be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it really provides you. It's interesting in that you can take a data-driven approach to coaching, a very data-driven approach to coaching. On maybe a little bit of a different take on that question is what we find. We're more on the technical side of the market, and so in hospitals and health systems where they have technical talent, we have seen that churn is pretty high. And so the reasons that we've seen for that is that a lack of engagement in learning. And so typically technical people are very driven to learn and want to be challenged all the time, want to work on challenging things. And one of the things that we've started doing is that we have assessments in technical skills, and we've started applying those technical skills and using those for learning. And using those it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Scott, where we have such an opportunity in this day and age to treat people like individuals and to tailor things at an individual level, because with technology, it's pretty scalable. And so when it comes to opportunities for learning and engaging people in working on complex problems and improving their skill set, and which really engages them with the company, using assessments to find their skill gaps and to direct them to the right types of learning resources. We found that there's a really strong appetite for that. That's something we've just more recently started doing. And what's been really interesting for us is that, the types of companies that we're able to talk to now that are really interested in that has been incredible. And it's just because there's so much sort of old school nature into that goes into learning, that a lot of people just go to training courses. They all go to the same training courses. But if you're really wanting to target and increase the engagement of specific individuals, then it has to be tailored to them. And so those types of predictive assessments that that we're talking about, or back to the question, can be used in that way to help engage people in learning kind of every day, and the type of stuff that specifically is tailored towards them.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking about how, with Dr. Scott talking about, being able to know what skills are best for these, these healthcare roles. And then you can use your test to see who's at risk based on those skills, who's at risk for leaving because they, as you're saying, Matt, they feel unsuccessful or there's a skill gap there. And so being able to close those gaps and retain them by, filling them and making them feel more confident in their job. Yeah, totally. That's a great question, Kent. Thank you for asking. We have another question here from Jennifer, but I was thinking, Matt, do you want to move to that? Dr. Scott had that great graph about how our assessments,
I was actually,
right there.
Yeah, thanks. I was actually just going to ask that.
Perfect.
And so, can I interject one thing about the healthcare workers? So
great.
Mentoring, right? I think matching people to mentors who understand the person, and maybe they have the same issues and they figured out how to overcome them, or it's a matching of, people learn in different ways. Multi-modality learning is critical. And it's another place where bias occurs. If we all assume that everyone learns the same way and we force everyone to learn the same way, then we're going to introduce bias into our learning processes. And if we use multi-modalities of learning, that's a big step. And if we think outside the box and include mentoring in that, it's a big part. And my first mentor in Washington, D.C. taught me that you could sneak off to watch movies next door at 2 o'clock every afternoon and no one would know. Well, I really didn't need to know that, right? And situations like that are not good. We need to use mentoring more, I think, and make sure that the mentors are someone who can help the person with what it is they need to overcome. Because I think everyone responds pretty well to, Matt's been through this before. He's helping me figure out how to get through it. These are things he has done. And I'm more likely to believe Matt because he's a real person and I can look at him and talk to him and ask him about it, than if you give me a book to read or give me a video to watch. So just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. That makes great sense. Earlier we were talking, Dr. Scott, about different assessment items and thinking about bias, and you were talking about kind of people doing their homework when they're signing up for something that actually they use in the hiring process. And I wanted, this is a great topic related to that just, I don't know, people don't normally think of this type of thing as to where some bias comes from, specifically around, again, diversity in the candidate pool versus diversity in the types of assessment items you have. So can you talk about this a little bit?
I will. And this is a fairly technical piece here, but it's easy to understand that any assessment that you use has some distribution of items, right? So let's say it's an agreeableness, a personality scale that's measuring agreeableness or like, or whatever you want to call it. The common term is agreeableness. Well, at one end of agreeableness is Mother Teresa, and the other end of agreeableness is probably Hitler, right? Well, we're not going to be assessing Mother Teresa. We're not going to be assessing Hitler. We're going to be assessing some much narrower band of folks who are actually applying for our job. And we want the assessment items to closely match the distribution of the applicant's ability or personality or whatever it is we're measuring. Otherwise, we're going to first ask them things that they don't have a reasonable response to because they don't understand the material, which is frustrating for the applicant. It's going to be unreliable and it's going to end up being biased. So it's critical that, and Matt, you and I both, we take different approaches to this. You use computer adaptive testing. I use an approach where I match the distribution of my item set to the distribution of the applicant population, but we get to the same end point, which is each applicant in the population is going to take a set of assessment items that they can that will elicit a reasonable, meaningful response. So we're not wasting their time throwing items at them that there's no way that they can respond to in a meaningful manner. And everyone, and I've seen by watching this closely and doing this work with our assessments, it increases the people who take the assessments are happier after they've taken the assessment. Their satisfaction is higher. We have 95% completion rates versus for unproctored online assessments, which is incredible. I mean, usually you get a 60% completion rate. But if you've matched the item set to the actual distribution of the construct in the population, it has a number of wonderful outcomes from that. And it improves that assessment tremendously.
Yeah, we think about it very similarly, as you mentioned, that if I'm at this level, if I'm at on a 5-point scale, if I'm at a level of 2 in skill in a particular area, but we keep asking level 5 questions, questions that are higher difficulty, way higher than your level, we don't actually learn a single thing about yourself, not a single thing. We just know that you're not at a 5. We don't know where you are. We just know you're not at a 5. And it just doesn't really tell us very much, which is where adaptive testing kind of comes in.
That's absolutely right. If you think about it in terms of school tests, we don't give our 3rd graders a bunch of 6th grade level items because they're not going to understand them. They're going to get discouraged. They're going to get, there's all kinds of negative things that are going to happen. And plus, we're not going to learn any more about them than we did. The information function is going to be very low. We're also not going to give them kindergarten items because then we're not going to learn anything other than they're not in kindergarten anymore. So in educational testing, this is a requirement, and we need to think about the same thing when we're testing applicants, particularly to do it in a fair and valid manner. This increases reliability, which increases validity, and it decreases bias.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about, and I know we're going to open up for questions, one of the things we've talked about before is the importance of reading level. It doesn't matter if it's in assessment, or oftentimes companies will give someone a sort of a take-home assignment or some project to do, and they're going to have to read something in. And so if you're not thinking about reading level, again, it goes back to what you were saying, is you want to make sure that the reading level, just like what this slide is showing, the reading level that you're actually sending it out to is representative of what's required for the job, because you're going to start you'll start bringing bias into the process by actually sending things out that are at a reading level much higher than what's required for the job. And so you'll have candidates falling out of the process that shouldn't be falling out of the process, right?
Absolutely. Amen. It has to happen at every step of the selection process, from the recruitment, the job announcement, the job description, the interview, onboarding, materials, every point at which the reading level needs to be written in a vocabulary. We write everything at a 3rd grade level. And frankly, that 3rd graders can read as well as most anyone really needs to in the United States. We've designed our educational system that way, that by 3rd grade, you should be able to read all that you need to do to survive as an adult. And most of the time, you can describe whatever it is you're trying to describe at a 3rd grade level. At the worst case, maybe 6th grade level, but you keep it as simple as possible. And that makes it more reliable, more valid, more fair. That's right.
Yeah. McCall, we can stop there. Are there questions?
Yeah, we've got one question in now. Guys, we are going to be on here until noon. So if you have more questions, pop them in the Q&A and we'd love to answer them. So this question comes from Jennifer, and it's about access. So often people of color and minority backgrounds are perhaps less tech savvy, live in more crowded situations, or have less access to good technology. How can companies help prevent these factors from inhibiting their employment and productivity opportunities?
Scott, do you want
to access to technology? You want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, there's multiple. You could take kind of whether it's let's start with that access to technology piece.
So is it from the perspective of so they've not been able to acquire those skills?
Right.
Yeah. And so, some of these things there are aspects of this problem that can be solved today, and there are aspects of this problem that have to be solved over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that one, in my opinion, tends to be something that has a longer term solution, and that's where, if you look at schools where they're actually injecting technology earlier in the process, and so there are organizations like, I'm a board member at Tech Birmingham, and there are a lot of programs in the city of Birmingham, which has a much higher population of minorities than out in other areas around Birmingham. But there are programs in the city of Birmingham around STEM type programs, or around programming or getting access to technology. And so I think that's part of it, is there's a long-term solution here. But then I think the second part of it is, as you are evaluating the skills needed for a job, it goes back to what Scott talks about in terms of job fit, that, really think about, oftentimes I've noticed, and I do this as well, is when I've posted jobs for different openings I've had in the past, and I've run tech teams is kind of my background. And so as I posted openings in the past, I was actually requiring in the job description way more than anyone on the team had. And so I'm actually discouraging, I'm discouraging people from applying that I would want to apply, because I'm putting the bar so high in the written job description. I'm going to discourage those people from even applying. And so I think when there's a situation where there is a lack of representation anyway in the candidate population, you're only further discouraging that by putting the job description at a level that's not actually meeting, that's beyond the level needed for the job. I don't know if you have things to add to that, Scott, or...
Well, I'll put my program evaluation hat back on, because if I was going to evaluate a program in which this was one of the problems, the first thing I would ask is, did you identify your stakeholders, and how good of a job did you do of that, and including representatives of all the stakeholder groups? And did you get them together and let them give you free and open information, and how did you use that information? Because the people in the communities have the answers to this. Or if they don't have the answers, they certainly know the problems. They're the ones that are going to tell you what the hurdles are, what are the obstacles. And by going to the stakeholders, stakeholder input, stakeholder feedback, focus groups, all of that builds up the reputation in the community that you really are trying to do something good, and you are listening. And then the second step is you actually have to use it, and then evaluate it, and go back to the stakeholders and say, okay, we tried these 3 things and they didn't work. What did we do wrong? And it's continuous communication with those folks who you care about and who care about you, I think. But that's my program evaluation approach. I mean, that's it, and it's amazing. In most government programs, there's always a program evaluation. Ever since, I don't know, the last 10 years probably, that people realized, well, you've got to get stakeholder input. You got to identify a stakeholder group, and you have to get your input, or you're going to be biased.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing, Scott, that I thought you could touch on, you sort of referenced this earlier, but what about the situational judgment tests, and how those, there was a lot of excitement when they first came on the scene, and what are your thoughts around them now?
Well, I do not see any way that you can write a situational judgment test that is not biased. And I've gone on record about that many times. And situational judgment tests were designed to reduce bias. And anytime you create a test in which you've got a lot of language in it, a lot of words, well, you better watch out, right? And then these words are specific to a situation in a job. Oh my, right? There's strike number 2. Well, what if you've never been in the job? You could do it, but you have no idea about the situation. And then you ask people to answer them in such a way that, oh, most anybody can. Well, what's the best thing you could do? What's the worst thing you could do? Well, I have no idea. I've never even seen this situation before. I could do it if you taught me. I have the potential to do the things that are required on the job, but you're asking me to do all of this reading and then make decisions that humans are not very good at all. And it is just, I don't know. I think that it was a mean response to a problem that needed to be solved, and perhaps the folks that came up with it were well intentioned, but I have yet to see one that was not inherently biased.
Yeah.
And we can predict all of the things that the situational judgment test does with ability tests and personality tests that get at the basic constructs that are driving what's going on in a situational judgment test. And those are simpler methods, and methods that we know that we can keep the bias out of. It's like these video interviews or anything like that, and virtual kinds of things. Well, oh my gosh, we have no idea what all's going on in there, but there's a lot, right? There are a lot of factors going on in a simulation. And how to keep the bias out of all of that, I suppose it's possible, but why go with a really complex solution whenever you can solve the same problem with a much simpler solution that is actually more predictive than the more complex solution? And we're not trying to entertain job applicants. I'm sorry, but that's just not true. When somebody is seriously looking for a job, they typically don't want to be entertained by some game. It gives them the totally wrong idea from day one. No, this is work. This is going to be a job. You're going to go there and work. This is a serious matter. You're applying for a job. We want to know some things about you that will be easy for you to respond to. It's going to be fair. It's going to be unbiased. And it will tell us how well you fit the job and why, and what we can help you to do to succeed. So the more elegance in science is simplicity, right? And the more elegant the solution, the better off we are, especially when we're trying to control something as complex as bias.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Wrapping up here, guys, we've got 5 minutes left. In the next 20 years, what do you think people will look back on in this particular period of time and realize it made their business stand out? So what are things that people can do now that are going to change kind of the course of the next 20 years?
Yeah.
Use this opportunity with this huge unemployed group to increase their talent, increase their diversity, change their culture. Look at their strategic plan. Start with the strategic plan of your company and see what is it going to take to support that. First of all, is it fair, right? What is our strategy where we want to be as a company? And then align your jobs and your people to support that strategic plan. And then you'll look back 20 years from now and say, my gosh, that's the point at which we really turned the corner and became really successful and much more fair. Our people are better off. We're better off. We made a positive impact on the communities in which we serve, which at the end of the day is what we all want to do.
Yeah. I think, McCall, if you look at the skills, sort of the future of work you hear people talk about a lot, there are skills that organizations are not typically full of right now. Data skills, some of these skills where it's just not optional to have those skills anymore. And so it is a tremendous opportunity to kind of reskill your workforce as people have kind of shrunk down their teams and now they're going to build them back up. There are tremendous opportunities to do that, but also, opportunities around upskilling the people they already have and investing in those people and using this as an opportunity to really be truly an inflection point on the skills of the entire organization, in addition to, of course, the diversity of the organization, as Scott was talking about, and so on. This is an opportunity to really see an inflection point in skill and some of the skills that are needed in the future that organizations are struggling with right now. I think this is an opportunity to really to have a big change in that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dr. Davies and Matt, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like I can speak for everyone that this was really informative and interesting and, of course, timely. So I hope that you guys enjoyed the webinar and have some takeaways to start to implement back into your business. I'll be sending out the recording of this tomorrow so that you'll have access to it and can share with anyone that wasn't able to attend. But once again, big thank you to Scott and Matt for participating in this webinar, and thank you to you guys for joining.
All right.
See ya.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, everyone.